Welcome to the Foreman Coaching Channel, where we talk about being a foreman in the construction industry and make you a bomb foreman. This is an episode about red flags, bad habits. A lot of you guys, you may or may not be old enough to be parents, but I'm going to tell you, I got a couple kids, and it's funny the trouble that they get into. And as a parent, like it might be the trouble that you got into as a kid, and you know what they're doing. When they're lying to you, you know it because like you got into that same kind of trouble when you were a kid, right? And you can kind of see right through it. And because I was a foreman for quite a few years before I got into the office as a project manager and stuff, I know the kind of things that foremen do out there. And so there's some things that now that I'm in the office, I look at differently than when I was in the when I was in the business of being a full-time foreman. It's funny too, I mean, just talking about that for a minute. I always thought that after you had been a great foreman for a long time, you move up to being a general foreman, and then you move to the office because that's the upgrade, right? That's the upgrade. But it makes no sense in hindsight to do that, because once I did get into the office, I got to tell you, a lot of the paperwork and the technical analysis of how a job is going has zilch to do with being able to turn the tools. And like, to make a basketball analogy, if you were the best like point guard or whatever, they wouldn't decide to make you coach. And the coach can't dunk over the tallest guy on the team. What I'm trying to say is, just because you install the best, it makes no sense to then take you out of that gig and then make you the leader, where you don't do that anymore, really. But that's what happens in the field. There's just another quirk of the construction industry. You in the basketball, my basketball metaphor, like, you go on to being a coach after you retire, and you don't do that anymore. But as long as you're a kick-ass point guard, you just keep being a point guard, man. Yeah. Well, so when I was out in the field, I know that it can feel pretty busy when you're on a job, you're running work, and sometimes, despite your best planning, you run into needing something. Box of screws, sheetrock anchors, whatever it is, 20 more feet of conduit. Hopefully you're in a good space where one of your workers is just crushing it and burning you right out of material, and you're like, holy cow, I'm going to be out of material. I need to get material. Well, here's one bad habit that I always notice when my guys are doing this. The foreman leaves the job site to go get the material. Now, because I was a foreman, I get why. You want a break. We all want a break. It's nice. It's fun. I don't know, maybe fun was pushing it too far. But it's nice to go get in your truck, probably a company truck, take 20 minutes of windshield time to drop down to the supply house, visit old, Jerry, whoever, across the counter at the supply house. Sometimes the supply house has coffee or popcorn. Pick up your box of screws, say sayonara, and then drive back. But I'm telling you, guess what happened on the job while you were gone? Everybody took a bathroom break, took a smoke break. They're standing around talking to it. Productivity just dumped while you were gone. I promise you it did. Why would the most expensive person, who is also the leader of the crew, be the one to go pick up a box of screws? It makes zero sense, okay? Have the apprentice go do it. I mean, even better, think of it ahead of time, right? I mean, that's the real thing, is if another red flag, if I see I'm getting too many slips, too many supply house visits in a day, you're clearly not planning far enough ahead and ordering material. But we'll get to that in a second. Point being, if you're the one who finds themselves in a pinch and you're the one who's running to go get that material, that is extremely inefficient. You should be on the job leading the guys. It's a red flag. I notice it. That's all I'm saying. Your office notices it too. So it's a bad habit. Just get in the habit of sending the apprentice. Don't do it yourself, okay? Because if just because your shop may not be saying anything to you, believe me, I talk to a lot of other shops. They know, and they talk to each other. When it comes time to say it to you, it's gone on so long, and they know that they're finally going to say something about it. But you're not getting away with it. Those paper tickets come into the office, or digital tickets, and they see it. They know, okay? They know. Knock it off. The other thing is too many supply house runs, right? That just shows an inability to actually plan ahead far enough to have materials on site to just work steadily. Now, I understand it happens now and then, okay? There's some conditions where it happens, okay? So, but you need to have a good batting average, okay? So the conditions where it might happen is the general contractor's switching gears on you. And what I mean is maybe instead of doing wall rough in, you're doing ceiling rough in, and you need ceiling wires. And you didn't plan on doing that, but you're trying to roll with the punches and be efficient, okay? Whole nother video on the schedule not going down the way it was supposed to, but it happens very often. And, maybe you didn't have this, maybe you weren't ready to pivot, okay? When you're a better foreman, you'll be ready to pivot. But if you weren't ready to pivot, maybe you don't have the materials there, and that happens quite a bit. So that's an acceptable reason. The other good reason is you got somebody on the crew that is just smoking the material. Maybe you're doing receptacle trim out, and you had 100, and you didn't think you were going to go through that many, and they're gone. They're gone. Somebody just blew through them. Well, you probably better quality control check the installation. But if the installation looks good, yeah, maybe you better just keep feeding the beast, man. Keep feeding material to that person and keep moving. And maybe you got to run down to the supply house to do that. And maybe you better put in an order so you can get 5x that, tomorrow or something, get ahead of it. Ideally, you never want somebody that you're paying $100 an hour to be driving to the supply house and eating popcorn and buying a box of screws, right? So now that I'm in the office, anytime I see that, I'm like, failure to think. Okay, so going back to my analogy, just because you're the best, you might have been the best installer during your time as a journeyman. Now that you're a foreman, you're a thinker. You're not an installer anymore. Sorry, bud. So what that means is you need to be thinking ahead. And the way a lot of foremen dig a hole for themselves and don't actually turn out to be a good foreman, even though they're a good installer, is they keep trying to install. They keep thinking that their installation ability is going to make them a good leader. And to be honest with you, there's some crossover and some contribution, but for the most part, probably 75% of being a good foreman has nothing to do with being a good installer, okay? Being a good foreman means that you are keeping everybody busy, you're staying out in front of everybody, you're planning, you're watching the schedule, you're keeping materials and tools staged and cached and ready, and you have layout ready, okay? That's all the thinking stuff that you need to have ready to go every single day. So when you're dropping down to the supply house multiple times in a day, guess what that's telling me? It's telling me you're not staying ahead of the job. And a lot of foremen, I don't really mean to talk about this part too long, but where a lot of foremen go wrong is they were a great installer, they became a foreman, and they try to dig themselves out of a productivity hole by pitching in and working themselves. Okay, that is not a good way of going about things. That, when I see that happening, I realize the foreman was unable to think themselves ahead of productivity and the problem, and had to just basically say, screw it, I just have to go back to work. I just have to be a journeyman, okay? Now, there's some crossover when you're talking about very small jobs, 1 or 2 guys, okay? The foreman's going to be working a lot on those jobs, so long as all the thinking is done. Okay, this applies no matter how many men are on the job at all, even if you're on the job alone. If the thinking part isn't done, you shouldn't be working, okay? And that is material recs planning, watching the schedule, understanding the blueprints, all that kind of stuff, okay? If the thinking part isn't done, you shouldn't be working. The more guys you have on the project, and I mean guys in the royal sense, all men, women, everybody, the the more you need to be looking at the blueprints and thinking your way ahead of things. Okay, example, I got a pretty new foreman, and he's a perfect example of a journeyman that just kicked ass. Really good installer. So my company, we decided he'd make a good foreman, because that's what you do. You take your best point guard and you pull him out of the game, and you say you should be a coach instead. We don't need you as a point guard anymore. More on this topic later. It's a talking point. There's not an answer there. But anyway, so he's a foreman now. And he gets this, he's running a job, and he's got 2 guys working for him, and I think actually 2 guys and an apprentice. Anyway, I called him and I says, hey man, I know that you are an excellent journeyman. Everybody wanted you on their team. No question you can install. I'm not sure you can lead yet. So this will be interesting for you to see how it goes for you in leading other people, communicating how to do the work to other people, and keeping up. Because one of the biggest problems foremen have is looking at the work through their own lens of really high productivity. Okay, so most foremen were high productive journeymen. So then when they become a foreman, they judge everybody through this lens of uber high productivity. And if somebody's not installing as fast as they would, they start panicking and they want to pitch in and start doing it themselves. But then when they do that, they fall behind on the thinking part of it, staying ahead, watching the schedule, and they actually end up falling behind on the job. And that's exactly what happened to this foreman. He's in the trim out phase of this job, and he's behind and he's kind of panicking. He's working, I think, you can tell he's panicking because the manpower on the job is starting to ramp up, even though we're at the end of the job. At the end of the job, you should be ramping down. If you're ramping up, that's another sign things are going wrong. So he's ramping up, and I talked to him, and he says, I've just been stretching myself thin, working really hard. And I says, what do you mean you're working really hard? You got a couple guys working for you. I would expect you're in the drawings and prints and ordering material and doing layouts like maybe half the day every day, for your situation. And he's like, ooh, that's, half the day. That's a lot. And he never thought about how much you need to be working just to stay ahead of the guys. And that's the point. That's the point. Okay, leading requires a lot of work. You need to be the smartest guy on the job. You need to win the trivia game in the meetings when they're talking about the blueprints and the specs and all that kind of. You need to just know all that stuff and have the material and the tools and the layouts ready to go. All right, so bad habits. Judging other people through the lens of your own work history. Okay, and it took me a long time to get over that. And just one more little point on that. How fast should you be working? Excuse me. Is one of the most common problems out there as well. A misunderstanding of how fast you should be working, okay? And I'm just going to touch on this really lightly because there's going to be a whole another video series set about this question specifically, okay? Think about a mechanic. When you take your car to a shop to have, let's say you're having the transmission replaced, and there is book hours, like maybe a transmission replacement for your car is 10 book hours. And they'll put a mechanic on it, and the mechanic will get paid 10 book hours no matter how long it takes them. Okay, the point is, they know how long transmission replacement should take, book hours. Well, the electrical industry has something like that as well. It's called labor units. And there's a whole manual of labor units. So when a contracting company, electrical contractor bids on a job, let's make it easy. Let's say the job is 1,000 feet of 3/4 inch EMT. You do a quantitative takeoff, which means you measure and count how much EMT is there. Okay, there's 1,000 feet. And then you look up in the manual labor of units, how much labor is it going to take to install 1,000 feet of EMT. And this data comes from the data in the manual of labor units. It comes from like 75 years of studying electricians installing product, okay? And it comes up with a number, and that's what electrical contracting companies typically use in order to provide estimates. How much labor? Well, you cross-reference the thing to the manual labor unit book, and it comes up with a number. So in the case of the mechanic, maybe it takes 8 hours to do a tranny job. In the case of a contractor and 1,000 feet of EMT, maybe it takes 80 hours. I don't know. I'm just picking that. I know that's not the number. I'm just picking something out of thin air, but you would be able to look it up in the Manual of Labor Units and determine that. Okay, so how long should something take? This same foreman that I was just telling a story about, he calls me and he says, okay, I got a new journeyman. Her name is, let's say, Sarah. I'm just going to make a name because I don't want to say her real name. And I've got her installing receptacles, and I'm not sure, if that's going fast or not. And I says, really? Did you know, I said to him, the manual labor units to install a receptacle is like 15 minutes? He says, I didn't know that. And I says, yeah, so as long as she's installing, per that, then she's on track. She's doing a good job. You might see an apprentice blow, 20 outlets out in an hour, and then you got to go back and fix half of them. Or maybe he does that, and then he just flat out runs out, and then he's back and forth with the gang box, and it'll actually average out to, 20 minutes per receptacle by the end of the day. This particular journeyman had loaded up a cart, put a bunch of receptacles on there, pre-did all the pigtails, and then went about the install and, smoked estimate expectations by the end of the day. So how long should something take? That's something you don't really know, even if you're a top-notch journeyman, because top-notch meaning, maybe you have really great installation rates. You've managed to beat those margins for your company for a long time. So back to the point, you're looking at other people through this lens of how you did things, and you're thinking that other people aren't sufficiently fast enough because you're comparing them to yourself, when the reality is they might be doing just fine, and you need to focus on your leadership, So that's a tough one as a foreman in the field to understand, that you need to focus on leadership. And when you're diving in and doing the work, especially if you have more than 2-3 people on the job besides yourself, if you're diving in and doing the work, my expectation, if I'm a project manager and I show up, is I should be able to hit you with, if you're working, then you must have your plan already laid out for the next 2 weeks, all your materials and tools cached for the next 2 weeks, and a couple backup plans just in case something happens and the job schedule needs to pivot. Okay, if all of those things are like done and you're on top of it and there's just nothing left to do, then sure, go to work, But if those things aren't done, then you shouldn't be working. Okay, I maybe I got a little bit off topic because I was talking about bad habits, and we talked about going to the supply house. We talked about going to the supply house personally and number of visits to the supply house. Here's one more thing I'm going to tell you about that is a super bad habit of a foreman, and that is starting things you can't finish. And I don't mean you personally, although it does apply to you personally. Mainly it's your crew, because you're in charge of tasking your crew, right? So don't start things you can't finish. Here's why. There is a very common problem that comes at the end of a job, that when this problem happens at the end of a job, you realize the foreman has been starting things he can't finish. That is, I like to call it 95% of the job is 75% done. 95% of the job is 75% done. Okay, just think about that for a minute and you'll get what I'm saying. You get to the end, and it looks like everything is done, but when you get into the details, it's not done. There's little things left open tickets I'll call it, on virtually every aspect of the job. And you're about to get annihilated in cleaning up small details everywhere. 90% of the job is 75% done. And the reason that happens is because, going back in time, to earlier in the job history, you probably started things that you weren't going to be able to finish. Maybe the home run, maybe you installed pipe and wire and receptacles in a wall, but something about the project prohibited you from actually running the pipe all the way to the panel and completing the wire back to the panel. So when you're standing there looking at the wall, everything looks done, but the secret is that only the foreman knows there's no home run connection. Okay, maybe the boxes aren't made up to all the lights. All the lights are hanging in place, the pipes ran, the wires ran. Maybe the boxes are even closed because you wanted to pass an inspection, but none of the wires made up in the boxes. Okay, you guys know what I'm talking about. Super bad habit. Super bad habit. If you just don't even start doing something unless you're going to complete it. Or if you've started something, commit to completing it. Don't get pulled off task and change. You have to complete things along the way, or you find yourself in this trap. And when you find yourself in this trap at the end of the job, I know exactly what happened, through the life of the job. It's kind of like you can kind of tell how a cookie, this is a terrible analogy, but have you ever ate a cookie that has a missing ingredient or a food that has a missing ingredient? And you immediately know this is missing the baking soda or this is missing the salt. When I see a job that has like boxes that aren't made up or missing home runs, we thought we were done. You're a week away from final inspection, and all of a sudden now you realize this is missing, this wire's missing, the feeders aren't pulled, this isn't made up. Then the foreman has been doing a piss poor job going back in time of completing as you go. And that creates a massive punch list, and now you have to man up at the end of the job, which is the nail in the coffin. You should never have to man up at the end of the job. It's real bad news, okay? Okay, so bad habits by foreman. Not finishing, not running your job in a way that you're finishing as you go, going to the supply house too much, and going to the supply house yourself, not a foreman. All right. I think I gave you enough bad habits to consider for today. Those are the biggest ones, to be honest with you. If you got some bad habits you'd like to talk about, drop some comments in below, and maybe I'll make a video in the future talking about the bad habits that you brought up. Today's secret word is speaker. If you watched this video all the way to the end, type speaker into the comments, and I got something awesome for you. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Foreman Coaching.